Welcome to this evening main event or only event. And so this will be, this is part, as you know, of the American Mathematical Society meeting of the Western section that's taking place on campus this weekend. And it's also part of the Bay Area Science Festival. And it's co-sponsored by the American Math Society, the Bay Area Science Festival, and the Mathematical Science Research Institute in Berkeley. And I'm just going to introduce the introducer. I'm Michel Lapidus, the AMS Associate Secretary in charge of this meeting. And our introducer tonight is David Eisenbud, who is a former president of the American Mathematical Society and current director of the MSRI, Mathematical Science Research Institute in Berkeley.
It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Jim Simons, a dear and now old friend. He's going to talk about luck, and I want to talk about luck too, and I'll start with a sort of personal story. My father, Leonard Eisenbud, was a physicist and joined the physics department at Stony Brook in 1957, just 1 year after it started. Stony Brook is a great place now, but it had growing pains, and at one point the math department was in such terrible shape that the provost felt he needed to have a committee of outsiders to find a new chair, and that no one in the department would do, so they went searching for an outside chair. Various people applied, and my father was on the committee that was to make the choice. And they made some pretty questionable choices, among them this inexperienced young guy, Jim Simons, who'd never done any administration before and really was too young for the job. And they interviewed the candidates, and the provost, when he interviewed Jim, according to Jim, said, "You know, of all the people I've interviewed, you're the only one who actually seems to want the job." And indeed, nobody else took the job, and Jim did. Talk about luck for Stony Brook. I feel I've been touched by that luck too in getting to know Jim. PhD from Berkeley in 1958 with Bertram Costant, whom I saw in the audience a moment ago. Where's Bertram Costant? Somewhere around, unless he left again.
61.
61. Oh, your Wikipedia entry is questionable. He was the winner of the AMS Veblen Prize in 1976. Is that the right date? He discovered that minimal manifolds can have singularities starting in dimension 7. Not such an obvious construction. Now very famous for Churn-Simons theory, which is applied in math and physics in all kinds of unexpected ways. In 1982, a change of life, he founded Renaissance Technologies, and in some sense the amazing chapter, really even more amazing chapter, started then. He did nothing but use math and a lot of talented people's work to become one of the richest men on earth, and has now been sharing his wealth and his luck with the rest of us who are here. And now we'll all share the luck again in listening to Jim himself. Jim.
This is a high thing. Okay, I guess you can hear me. Thank you very much for such a nice introduction. So I'm going to kind of talk about my life and its various peregrinations. Some of it about math and some of it about common sense and some of it about good luck. And then I'll take some questions if there are any. So I always liked math when I was a little kid. I didn't think of it as math, just numbers and having fun. But I discovered Zeno's. So this is proof of my thoughtfulness as a child. I discovered Zeno's paradox at about 4 years old, not knowing it was anybody's paradox or not knowing what the word paradox meant. But I learned from my father, to my horror, that a car could run out of gasoline. And I said, well, shouldn't run out. You could use half of what you have, and then you could use half of that, and then you could use half of that, and you'll never run out. And it didn't occur to me that you'd never get anywhere either. But on the other hand, my family doctor, Dr. Kaplan, he knew I was a bright boy, and he said, well, you're a bright Jewish boy, you should be a doctor. That's a great field. And I wanted nothing less than to be a doctor. And I said, well, I don't really want to be a doctor. I want to do something like with engineering or math or something. I didn't know much. I was about 8 years old. And he said, well, you can't make any money doing that stuff. And I said, and that didn't seem to be very much of an impediment at 8 years old. I wasn't thinking about making a lot of money. I was just thinking that I did not want to be a doctor, which was a very good choice for me, and it turns out for anyone who would have had the unfortunateness to be my patient, because I would not have done a very good job. But I did like working, and my first job was as a stock boy in Breck's Garden Supply during the Christmas season. They hired kids, a few people, and I got this job. A stock boy works down in the basement in this particular place, bringing stuff up to the floor and putting stuff away. But I was not a good stock boy because I could never remember where anything went. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason, no order. It wasn't alphabetized or anything like that. You just had to know where things were. So the two people who ran it down there realized I was a failure as a stock boy, but I was there, so they said, okay, you can sweep the floor. And I loved that job. So then I had a big push broom and sawdust, and I could throw the sawdust on the floor and push the broom and walk up and down, keeping the floors clean and thinking, which I enjoyed doing very much. And it came to the end, and Christmas was past, and there was time for me to leave. So this couple sat me down and said goodbye and so on, and asked me what I was going to do. I was, I think, 14. And I said, oh, I'm going to study mathematics. I think I want to go to MIT. Well, they laughed very, very hard. And I'm sure they were thinking, this kid who doesn't even know where the dried sheep manure is going to go to MIT and study mathematics. Well, I did. I never got back to them and said, see, I did that. But I did. And I went to MIT and did study mathematics and realized that one could be a mathematician. But I really had an epiphany when I learned Stokes' theorem. Now, I guess you're all mathematicians, so you probably know Stokes' theorem. You integrate one thing over a boundary, and you take its differential, and that's the same as integrating that over the interior of something. And that, it's a great generalization of the fundamental theorem of calculus, and it works in all dimensions. And I thought it was the most beautiful thing, that theorem. And it really made me appreciate mathematics. It made me want to go into this field of differential geometry, which I had sort of gradually learned existed. And what sealed the deal was a delicatessen called Jack and Marion's in Boston. It's not there anymore, I'm afraid, but it was quite a place, and it was open very late at night. And as an undergraduate, we used to go there and hang out and eat, maybe at 2 in the morning, because young kids can eat at all hours, as some of you perhaps remember. But frequently, is Singer and Warren Ambrose, I guess everyone's heard of Singer. Ambrose was an older fellow. He must have been 50. He seemed ancient to me, although he was a great teacher. They would show up there and work. They'd go over to some booth and drink coffee and do mathematics. And I thought, my God, what a great life. Here are these grown-ups, and they're doing this stuff. They do it in dress and suits. They just had, regular outdoor clothes. And said, what a life this is. It's 2 in the morning. over sandwiches talking about math. So it was clear that that was for me. I graduated MIT. I graduated early, but I stayed one more year at graduate school. But when I graduated, which was in 1958, see, that's where the 58 came from. Where was David? He confused those dates. 58. I did something that was actually an example of having no common sense at all, but it turned out that there was some good luck involved. In those days, motor scooters had just been becoming popular, Vespas, and they were Italian. It was either a Vespa or a Lambretta. Those were the two choices you had. And we decided, I and a friend from Columbia, South America, an MIT friend, who was not a mathematician, we decided to ride our motor scooters, get motor scooters. We didn't have them. We didn't even know how to ride motor scooters, but we felt it couldn't be that difficult. We're going to ride them from Boston to Buenos Aires. Yeah, well, Boston, they both began with B, Boston to Buenos Aires. And we got the motor scooters, and a third guy joined the gang. And we did get halfway. We got to Bogota, and that took 7 weeks, and I at least almost died. I came extremely close to death. I think I never told my mother that. If my mother had had the slightest idea of how dangerous that trip was, she wouldn't let me go, but for some reason she did. And so I got there. Now, one of the themes of this talk is how important partners are and people that you work with. And so this fellow, this Colombian boy, and his friend subsequently became my first partners in a business venture, which I'll get to in a minute. But so it was lucky on that account, but it showed little signs of common sense. Anyway, I spent 1 year at MIT as a graduate student. They thought I'd been at MIT long enough that I should go to Berkeley and meet Churn, the great geometer of the day, and get a proper education in differential geometry, since that's what I seem to like. So I went there, and I got a nice fellowship. I went to Berkeley. The only thing is that Churn did not go to Berkeley. Churn was coming to Berkeley that year. That's why they said I should go there too. But Churn, perhaps knowing I was coming, decided to go somewhere else for that year. I guess he was on sabbatical or something. So I didn't see Churn. But I worked with Costin. Someone told me Bert Costin was here. Is he here? No, he's not here. I think maybe you didn't really see him. But anyway, I worked with a fellow named Bert Costin. But the first thing that I did when I got to Berkeley, or very early, was, I got married, actually. I got married within a month of getting there, and there was a wedding, and we even got wedding presents, and so which were cash. So we had some money, and I thought, well, it's just lying there. We should invest it. I didn't know anything at all about investing, but I knew that one could invest money. So I went to Merrill Lynch, and I was, now I was 21 years old, and said I wanted to open an account, and there were 2 stocks that I thought would be just terrific, and I wanted to buy these stocks. Well, I said, okay, and I bought the stocks, but I'm an impatient guy, and after a month, nothing happened. They didn't go down, they didn't go up, they didn't go anywhere, so I was bored with that thing. So I went back and said, isn't there something that's a little more lively and that I could, you have any ideas? And oh, yeah, he said, the soybeans. You should buy soybeans. And I had heard of soybeans. I'd never eaten one myself. It turns out perhaps most people haven't ever eaten a soybean, but pigs eat them in great quantities, and cows and so on. But I said, well, what does that mean exactly? He said, well, you buy 5,000 bushels. That's a contract. It's a futures market. Our guys tell us soybeans are going through the roof. You make a lot of money. I said, okay. So I bought 2 contracts of soybeans, and they did. They went up. I was making money. They went down. I was losing money. I sold them both. I got nervous. Then I bought 1 contract. Meanwhile, I was going back and forth from Berkeley into San Francisco early in the morning to watch the soybean market. And, early was, 8 o'clock in the morning already. I was out. I mean, that was very early for a graduate student. And after a couple of weeks, I came to the most sensible conclusion of my life, I think. I said, I'm either going to write a thesis or trade soybeans, because you couldn't possibly do both. And I came to that realization at a good point. I had a very small profit. I said, okay, I'm closing out the profit. And it was years before I ever traded a soybean again, although the occasion did arise. So then I went and worked on it. I mean, you couldn't do both. You couldn't write a thesis and trade soybeans. Anyway, I couldn't. So I did write a thesis, and it was a very gratifying experience. I wrote it. I'm sorry Bert's not here. But so I got some results, which I showed to my professor, and he said, oh, those are very interesting. That's nice. It suggests that a question that's open about holonomy groups. Anyone know what a holonomy group is? Probably a lot of you know it. Anyway, okay. Yes? Okay, some of you know. Anyway, it's a group that's associated to a connection on a manifold. Let's say on the tangent bundle, you can parallel translate all around and come back to where you started, and you move the tangent space. And it had just been shown all the possible, and that's a Lie group. It's a linear group of linear transformations. And it had recently been shown that there was a list of all the possible candidates for holonomy groups on an irreducible manifold, one you couldn't write as a product of 2 other Riemannian manifolds. And that list happened to include only groups that were transitive on the unit sphere. So every one of those groups, you would take any point on the sphere in the tangent space and bring it to any other point. So it was transitive. So that was kind of a question. Well, why are they all transitive on the sphere? And I said, oh, I want to try that problem. And he said, don't do that. He said, that's a very hard problem. So Borel tried it. He couldn't figure it out. So that was just like throwing gasoline on the fire. I said, well, I'm going to do that problem. And by perhaps a miracle, I did. So that was a good thesis. I was very pleased. I'd had some interactions with Singer along the way because he was interested in that problem, and we talked about it a little bit, or wrote to each other. And so then they finished that, and they hired me, and I went to MIT and became a Moore instructor. But, okay, so now I was an instructor at MIT, but I still had this sort of, urge to do something different. And when I had been in Colombia on my motor scooter trip, and we got to Bogota, and I saw Colombia and my friends, it was a very exciting country. You could do anything there, it seemed. There were all kinds of things that could be manufactured and one thing or another. And I had this friend down there who was very smart, in fact, 2 friends, and I said, you guys ought to start a business. And they said, well, I don't know. I said, I'm going to come down to Colombia, and I won't leave until we find a business. And not that I had any money particularly to invest in this business, so it turned out I did have a little bit. And I stayed there 2 weeks. We found a business. They said they were going to do it. The father of one of them put up half the money. I said, okay, I'll scrape, and my father and I put up a little bit of money. And then I went back to MIT after those 2 weeks, and of course it took a little while for all that to take place. But I decided after that first year, this is so exciting. I'm going to move to Colombia and work in this factory, in this place. It was another nutty idea. And so I took a job in the interim because the place wasn't ready. In fact, wouldn't have been ready for another 2 years or a year and a half in an engineering place while some engineering company. So I quit the Moore instructorship, and my job was to, computers were just coming in. My job was to calculate Bessel functions on a computer. Now, I didn't know what a Bessel function was at that time, although I certainly learned what it was. And they made antennas, and they needed, anyway, it was the most tedious, horrible thing one could do, was just calculate Bessel functions all day long. So I began to really miss academia. I was friends with Bott and with Singer and these guys, and so I said to Singer, you know, I think I made a mistake. And he said, oh, well, we'll put you on Bott's contract. Bott was a great mathematician at Harvard. In those days, you had an NSF contract. They were very loose. You could just hire someone on the contract. So I went on Bott's contract, and then I went back and said, okay, I'll let those boys run the factory, and I'll just be a minority investor, and I'll work on mathematics, which I did. And I was working on, as David mentioned, minimal varieties. And minimal varieties are manifolds that have minimal area or volume, depending on the dimension, with respect to their boundary. So a soap bubble is a minimal variety in 2 dimensions, typically. Not a soap bubble, but if you take a wire frame and dip it in soap, you'll get a film. That's going to minimize area. And so I was just studying that subject kind of from first principles. Almost all the work had been analysis, but I was trying to understand the geometry of these things, and was working slowly and going along. And they hired me at Harvard to be assistant professor. So I was at Harvard for a full 2 years, once on Bott's contract and once as assistant professor. But I actually didn't like Harvard. I don't know, there was something. Any Harvard men or women here today? Probably. Yes, there are some. Well, maybe with you there, I'd have liked it better. But and I don't even know you. But I don't know. It was a stodgy place, and also they started the factory, so I felt I needed a change. So I went. There's a place in Princeton that's still going strong, called the Institute for Defense Analyses, or it's a branch of the Institute for Defense Analyses. And there they would hire mathematicians, and it was super secret. It was a very highly classified place. They worked on secret codes and ciphers. In fact, in those days, you weren't even allowed to say what they worked on. So it was just stuff. But now it's permissible to say that's what they worked on. And it was. I didn't know anything about codes and ciphers, but I knew they paid a lot, and you could spend half your time doing mathematics, and as much as half, and the other half you had to work on their stuff. And that sounded pretty good. So we moved to Princeton, and well, I loved that job. I loved everything about it. I learned about computers. I learned first that I would never know how to program a computer with any skill whatsoever. But there were, fortunately, people who could. I learned I liked to make algorithms and think about testing things out on a computer. Maybe you can crack this code with this algorithm. Most of the time it didn't work. Sometimes it did. It was kind of exciting. And I liked the people. And I was still working away at minimal varieties. And after maybe 2 years there, maybe into my 3rd year, I solved this sort of famous problem in the subject of minimal varieties, which, and as David said, I showed that you could fill in smoothly. This is in codimension 1 in Euclidean space. So in Euclidean space, you have a boundary of 1 dimension lower, and you want 2 dimensions lower, like a curve in 3 space, whatever, and you want to fill in. And I proved that you could do that smoothly without any singularities through ambient dimension 7. So up to 6-dimensional surfaces and 7-dimensional space with a 5-dimensional boundary, I guess. It would work. You could do it, a uniform proof. But in 1 dimension more, my proof broke down, and I suggested a counterexample, which turned out to, and I couldn't prove it was I couldn't prove it was a counterexample. It was locally stable, but it might not have been globally stable. Now, so it's a beautiful thing. You take the three-sphere and you cross it with itself, so now you get a six-dimensional thing sitting in the seven-dimensional sphere in 8 space. Anyway, that's the boundary, six-dimensional boundary. The cone on that, which obviously, since it's a cone, clearly has a vertex and a singularity, but that does minimize volume, seven-dimensional volume, and then so that was a good result, and published this paper, which was everything I knew about minimal varieties was packed into this paper. But it was a good paper, and so that was very nice. And David said I won the Veblen Prize, and that's, I guess, what I won it for some few years later. And I was also doing good work for them. It was great, but it was the Vietnam War time. You remember, you all know about the Vietnam War, and some of you probably lived through it. And so now we didn't do any work that had anything to do with the Vietnam War as far as I knew, although, in fact, God knows what they did with what we did, because I never read any of the secret messages because we didn't have access to that stuff. We just tried to crack the codes. But I didn't like the war. Now, so the boss of my boss was in Washington, D.C. He was a general named Maxwell Taylor. Some of you probably remember old Maxwell Taylor. And he had been a general. Now he'd been kicked upstairs. He ran the Institute for Defense Analyses. And he wrote an article for the New York Times. It was a cover story in the magazine section, the Sunday paper, how we're doing so great in Vietnam. We're going to win the war. It's very important. Let's just hold still. It's a terrific enterprise. Well, I mean, I didn't think so. And I'm sure there were others who didn't think so. But I wrote a letter to the Times saying not everyone who works for General Taylor shares his views. In fact, I think the whole thing is stupid. And I mean, the words were classier than that, but but that was the effect of the letter. And they published that letter eagerly, I'm sure, because, no one said anything. I didn't hear anything from my superiors. I heard plenty from my friends, but okay. But then, a few months later, a young guy came, sought me out. He told me he was a reporter for Newsweek magazine. I think it still exists, but in those days it was one of the two big news weeklies, that and Time magazine. He's doing a story in Newsweek magazine on people who work for the Defense Department who are opposed to the war. And he said, I don't have many takers, but I wonder if I could interview you. Now, I was 29 years old. No one had ever asked me for an interview before. And I thought, oh, sure, of course you can interview me. So he interviewed me. And, so the bottom line was, I said, well, the rule at IDA is you have to spend half your time at their stuff, and you can spend half your time at your own stuff. And my algorithm now is that I'm spending all my time on mathematics, and when the war is over, I'll spend an equal amount of all my time at their stuff, so I'll make it all up and say that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing. Yeah, exactly. Oh, ho, ho, ho. Because, and it wasn't even quite true, but it was close to being true. Anyway, then I did the only intelligent thing I had done that day. I told my boss that I gave this interview. It would have been even more intelligent if I told him before I gave the interview, but I didn't. I told him after. He says, you did? He said, well, what did you say? I said, well, I told him about my half and half proposition and so on. He said, oh. He says, I have to call Taylor, his boss. So he called Taylor. My memory is a little faint on this point, but I think he may have called him in my presence, or maybe I had to leave the room. But it seemed like only a microsecond before he told me, you're fired. And I said, my title is permanent member of the a permanent member of this outfit. How can you find? He said, well, it used to be a temporary member. He says, I'll tell you the difference between a temporary member and a permanent member. He said, a temporary member has a contract. And a permanent member doesn't. So I didn't have a leg to stand on. They may have given me a week's severance. I don't remember what the deal was. But they were probably more generous than that. Anyway, there I was. I didn't have a job. I had a wife, 3 kids, and no job. But I wasn't, I had proved this theorem. I knew I could get an academic job. And so I wasn't, terrified at the prospect. It was all kind of exhilarating, actually, being fired. I think it's good once. You shouldn't make a habit of it. You shouldn't make a habit of being fired, but once is perhaps salutary. Anyway, I did get, as David said, this offer at Stony Brook to be chair, and I thought that would really be fun. As I've said before, I thought it would be better to be the firer than the firee. And the department was not strong. They had a great physics department at that time. It was a very new university, and I had a wonderful time building a department. And I met Frank Yang, the famous physicist who was there, and we became friends. And we had an interesting interaction. So he would, after a few months, he invited me up to his office. He was going to tell me what he was doing. I didn't know any physics, but he was, Nobel Prize winning great man, and I figured I'd go up and get a lecture. And so I sat down, and he told me what he was doing. He covered the board with equations. I didn't understand a goddamn thing. I didn't understand anything. I didn't know any physics, but, I looked, tried to look as intelligent as possible. I thanked him very much at the end, and I went back downstairs. And we repeated the same thing in year 2, and then again in year 3. But something happened in the middle of the lecture of year 3. He'd kind of shown me these same equations. They were getting familiar. And then I realized, I said, stop right there. He said, why should I stop? He said, because you're trying to invent mathematics that was done 30 or 40 years ago. He said, what? What he was doing was, in gauge theory, you use bundles and they have connections. But I think he didn't know, but you could also have, there was such a thing as parallel transport and a holonomy group and all that stuff. And he was tortuously trying to create parallel translation in a bundle with a connection. And I said, the mathematicians have done that. And he said, why would they have ever done that? Why would they study that kind of stuff? And I said, well, it was beautiful and natural, and it just came out anyway. How could I answer that question except to say it just came out of mathematics? So that was a great moment because he said, okay, so we had he organized a seminar of the members of this Institute for Theoretical Physics, and it was kind of a translation seminar. I said, we say this, you say that kind of thing. And he even wrote a glossary. He even wrote some kind of book with all these things. But it was the smartest group of students I ever had. It was his whole faculty, so it was, I had but it was great. And they gave me at the end a very thick dictionary because I'm a terrible speller. They gave me one of these things that weighs 100 pounds, and as a gift for that. So in the meantime, I was doing geometry myself, and I started working with Churn, the guy. We had become he came in the second year, and when I was at Berkeley, having missed the first year, but we became friends. We didn't do any science together, but we became friends. And I had, while at Stony Brook, come up with some geometry in 3 dimensions that looked quite interesting. I showed it to him, and he said, "Oh, well, we can do this in all dimensions. This is very exciting," and so on. So we worked together and developed and wrote a paper, and that was the roots of these Churn-Simons invariants, which have seemed to be used in a lot of places, which is, an example. I mean, here we did this math, and we didn't think, it's going to apply to this, that, or the other thing. We thought maybe it'll apply, maybe other mathematics we built on it, as I suppose it was. But the idea that it would find its way into physics 10 years later and become quite ubiquitous. I mean, it's in condensed matter physics, it's in high energy physics, it's in cosmology, Churn-Simons term. And I don't know what they're doing with it. I don't have the faintest idea. But mathematics is that way, and basic science is that way. You do a piece of basic science, and you don't know where it's going to go. But if it's pretty good science, it can lead to surprising places. I mean, when Maxwell developed the Maxwell equations, did television occur to him as a as a consequence? I don't think so. He just wanted to know how the hell how does this work, and obviously figured it out. So I was doing mathematics with Churn, and then with a guy named Jeff Cheeger. Grew out of that with something called differential characters, which now is kind of the root of a subject called differential cohomology, if you've ever heard of that. And we worked on that, and it led to questions that neither of us could figure out about rational numbers or certain volumes. Were they rational or irrational? We really wanted to figure it out, and we couldn't. Spent a couple of years struggling with those questions. I won't tell you where they came from. But in the meantime, my investment in Columbia paid off. So part of the company was sold. I had a few bucks. My father had more, but we had some money. And my Colombian friends, God knows why, said, okay, we have this money. We want you to invest it for us. Now, where they got the idea that I would be any better at investing for them than that broker at Merrill Lynch years ago, I don't know. But I said, fine, I'll do that. And I had a friend who had been a mathematician and was now a commodity trader. And he seemed to be doing pretty well. So I said, Charlie, we have this money. Would you manage it for us? And he said, yeah, of course. I'll be happy to, he said. Why not? It was more than he'd ever seen. So he thought it was good. And so I made a deal with Charlie. He was going to get 25% of the profits, no fixed fee, but 25% of the profits. And I said, but if we lose much money, and I said, if we lose 25%, you have to stop. We don't want to lose all the money. So that's a stop loss, okay? But as I was walking out of his apartment, something occurred to me. And I said, oh, also, if you make too much, we're going to have to stop. And he said, well, how much is too much? It's a reasonable question. I said, 10 times what we invested after your rapacious fee. Well, how could he say no? I mean, 10 times as much. So he said, fine. So that was the other stopping rule. We stopped on that basis after 10 months. He had multiplied the money by a factor, I guess, of 13, and when you take off 20. Anyway, we actually made 10 times our money. It was incredible. It was just completely lucky. I won't. I know it was completely lucky. But there it was. So now I really, had some money, and I had followed his work. I had followed his work carefully. In fact, I had to, because he never quite knew where he was. So I said, okay, I'll keep the books. Every week I'll tell you where you stand. He said, okay, that's great. It'll take my mind off that. So I did that. And so I learned a little bit about that, and it was the soybeans in my youth. And I thought, okay, mathematics is driving me crazy. I had recently gotten divorced. I was on the wrong side of the first wife. I was involved with another woman who turned out to be my second wife and my present wife. And I was frustrated with the work, so I thought, I'm going to go into business and be a trader. And I did. I did do that. And I started doing some trading, and that was working okay. I got some investors. I brought in a guy from IDA. He was the best cryptanalyst in the world. He was a wonderful model maker and so on. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Baum-Welsh algorithm or the EM algorithm. Anyway, it's a famous algorithm in statistics. He was the Baum of Baum-Welsh, so he was a very smart guy. And I said, I'm looking at these commodity charts. Actually, it was currencies that we were trading, and they seem to have some shape to them. They don't look random to me. So maybe we could make some models. And he said, okay. But it turned out, and we did. We made a model, and it looked like it was going to be okay and to trade. But we were doing fundamental trading, and he hated the model building. He said, but he loved the fundamental trading. He loved reading the newspapers and reading the tickers and the news tickers and getting ideas. And it turned out he was, for a while, very, very good. So we put the models aside for a while, and we traded. And we did very well. We did very well. But it was a gut-wrenching experience. One day you walk in and you think you're a genius. Oh, my positions are in my way. Look, and the next day you walk in and they're against you and you feel you're a dope. How could I have done what I did, and so on. There was no rhyme or reason. It was just, you put your finger in the air and you try to sense which way the wind is blowing. I'll tell you one story to illustrate the craziness. So it was a time when gold was going up. Gold had been you couldn't buy or sell gold, and finally you could, and the price was rising, and it was rising, and we had a deal where Lenny Baum and I, where we'd each have our own account. I was the boss, but we each had our own account. And in our own account, in fact, we both bought gold. We were supposed to be independent, but we both liked gold. The gold was going up. It started at $200 and $300 and $400, $500. It got to $500, which by today's standards would be like $1,500 or $1,800. And I said, this is a very high price. I'm getting out. And I sold my half. But Lenny, I think you should. No, you don't know how high this is going to go. You can't. This is going to go very, very high. I said, okay. So he stayed. It was $600. It was $700. It was $800. It got to $800. That day, I happened to be talking to a friend of mine on the phone who was a stockbroker, and in fact, he was my stockbroker. And I said, "How are things, Dick?" And he said, "Oh well, they're fine. This morning, my wife Lucy came into my closet and cleaned out all of my old tie clasps and cufflinks, and went downtown to sell them." They were gold. They were gold, see? I said, "Well, you having a hard time in your family? Why is she?" Your wife said, "Oh," he says, "she's a jeweler." I said, "Yes, I know that." So he said, "So she only has to stand in the short line." I said, "What do you mean, the short line?" He says, "Don't you know that people are lining up and standing for hours selling their gold?" I said, "No, I didn't know that. Thank you very much." We had a phone in those days. If you picked it up, it was a different phone. If you picked it up, you went right to the floor of the commodity exchange. And I got Lenny in the office, and I put the phone up to his ear, and I said, "Lenny, sell the gold." In fact, and he said, No. I said, "Lenny, I'm the boss. Sell the blankety blank gold." I was more emphatic than that. He said, all right. So he sold the gold. Maybe it was $810. Oh, but he was mad. And the next day, we came in, and it opened at $830. And he said, I told you. By the end of that day, it had dropped 25%. It was down to $600, all in one day. And it never, of course, went back up. So that is an example of common sense and very good luck. The good luck. If I hadn't called my stockbroker the day I did, Anyway, it held on to that gold. It went back to 200 after a while. We would have ridden it all the way down, I think. And so it was just plain luck that I had. But it was at least common sense that I thought, if everyone in the world is trying to sell their gold, how long can it be going up? You know, there is such a thing as supply and demand. So there it was. So that was what it was like to be a fundamental trader. It was stomach-wrenching. So Jim Axe, I got Jim Axe, who was a very well-known algebraist, to come and work for us. And he was interested in the models that Lenny eschewed. And he got a good computer programmer, and we built some models. And he showed that the models would use for currencies would work for all commodities. And we were on our way with models. And, well, we kept fundamental trading, but more and more we were trading the models. And finally, it took about 8 years. The models were good enough, and we went to all models. And then we started the company. This was a forerunner. We started the company called Renaissance Technologies, which has been going ever since. And it has 300 people. It has 90 PhDs. And it's 100%. It's 100% models, and it's been remarkably profitable for a long time. And other mathematicians came in to help. I don't know if Elwyn Berlekamp is here. Maybe some of you know Elwyn. Henry Laufer joined us, and they each made important contributions. So it has been remarkably successful. So people say, well, what's the secret? And well, there are a lot of little secrets, because the way this works, you have a lot of smart guys, and they keep inching away and getting a new idea here and a new idea there, and you pile them together, and soon you have an awful lot of little ideas that are independent of each other, and you can make some progress. But I think, so people say, what's the secret sauce? But the secret sauce was really, in the first instance, having very smart people working for the firm. We were academics ourselves. We had an idea of who was a good scientist and who wasn't, and we brought in and continued to bring in excellent people, not just mathematicians, but computer scientists, statisticians, experimental physicists, astronomers. We got 4 or 5 astronomers who are good. They look at data. They can't do experiments. You can't make this star bump into that star. You just have to have to take it as it is, and that's, and make models. So great scientists. We built a terrific infrastructure. The computer guys are wonderful. So we take in, I think it takes in 9 terabytes a day of data comes into that outfit. And it all gets stored and organized and dished up to the researchers and so on. So it's a great infrastructure. It's an open atmosphere. Everybody knows what everybody else is doing. And every week there's a research meeting. If you've had a good idea that you think it's going to go somewhere, you present it. If it looks good, it goes to a small meeting. People vet it more carefully. But there aren't little groups working in the dark. Oh, this is my little system, and I want you to use it. So, and that's the best way to do science, I think, in a collaborative manner. Sure, you don't immediately, the first time you have a thought, you don't run down the hallway saying, I have a thought. But, you test it out a little bit. But so I think that's a very good way to do things. Everybody has a piece of the profits. All the senior people own part of the business, and that, I think, is good too. So we have very little turnover, and we trade everything worldwide. We trade everything. It runs 24 hours a day, not 7 days a week, but I guess 5. And the only rule is we never override the computer. No one ever comes in any day and says, the computer wants to do this, that's crazy, we shouldn't do it. You don't do it, because you can't simulate that. You can't study the past and wonder whether the boss was going to come in and change his mind about something. So you just stick with it, and it's worked. So, well, so obviously I made money, And in 1974, with my wife Marilyn, we started a foundation, charitable. We'd been giving money away. Marilyn thought, hey, we should have a foundation. So we had a foundation. And it was a one-woman foundation. It was in her dressing room, and she had a little box with the records and so on. She studied accounting. She was actually a PhD in econometrics, but she didn't know anything about accounting. And so she took a night course in accounting. And I put something on the door of her dressing room. There was a wonderful cartoon. It showed a medieval setting, a big castle with a tower, and someone was standing on the tower addressing the multitudes below. And one of the multitudes people said to his neighbor, and to think he started life as an accountant. So, so she studied accounting, and we built up the foundation. Initially, we gave money very broadly to social causes, to universities, to a variety of things. But in 2004, which is just 10 years ago, we decided to just focus on basic science, and other kinds of giving that we did were done outside of the foundation, and the foundation grew. And it's very good. It's a good foundation. We have a large project on the causes of autism to try to understand that. It's really a lot of genetics and neuroscience. We have less applied things in various aspects of life science. We have a math and physical science program, in fact, that David Eisenbud, who's sitting right there, helped organize for us. So we have various kinds of grants and programs and one thing or another. And we also started in the last few years goal-driven collaborative projects. So that's as it's stated, it's a collaborative project consisting of maybe 10, 20, 30, 40, sometimes 50 scientists, typically in different places, but all working towards a common end. We have one on the origins of life, which is an underfunded thing. You can't imagine the NSF's going to, certainly not the NIH is not going to give you any money for the origins of life, but it's really fascinating, and that's a project. We have a project called Many Electrons, which is sort of a material science, condensed matter physics, trying to model the clouds of electrons inside materials. It's a many body problem, really, but you have, not only is it many bodies which are electrons that would normally repel each other, but you also have, they're entangled. If you guys know what entanglement means, it's a strange phenomenon in quantum mechanics. So modeling these big clouds of electrons is extremely difficult to do, even though the first principles are well known, but so what? And so that's a project, and that's going quite well, actually. We have a project in microbial oceanography, studying all the interactions between the myriad of microbes in the oceans, and a number of other things. So it's quite a vibrant foundation, and I think maybe some people here have been beneficiaries. Anyone gotten a grant from us? Yeah. Oh, you're all in the first row. Okay. I didn't realize that. Okay, well, I mean, I knew some people here got grants. So we give all kinds. Oh, but someone way back there. Why aren't you in the first row with these beautiful girls? So that's the foundation. Now, actually, under less than wonderful circumstances, I went back to my older age and to do mathematics again. And in 2004, we lost a son. We lost one of our sons, and that was obviously very sad. And kind of as a refuge, I just started thinking about math. And, you know, doing mathematics, you can retreat into your head, and you're just thinking about a problem, and it can blot out other stuff. And I thought about a problem in what's now called differential cohomology that I had thought about before, and I got serious about it. And it turned out I later discovered there was a group of Germans. Any Germans in the audience? Well, anyway. Okay, there are some Germans in the audience who were working on the same problem. I didn't know that at the time. But I got an idea of how to solve it. But it needed some topology, which was beyond me. And I spoke to my friend Dennis Sullivan, who probably you've heard of, who's a great topologist. And together we solved this problem. We beat out the Germans. They were very nice Germans, actually. They came over and they had some other results that we didn't have and so on. And so it was all very collegial, but nonetheless we beat them. And so that was gratifying. And since then I've written a couple of other papers with Dennis. So I'm back in a small way doing some mathematics. So I retired from Renaissance in 5 years ago, 2009, and I'm the chair, so I go to a monthly meeting, but those guys are doing a wonderful job. Peter Brown and Bob Mercer, who came out of IBM 20 years ago, and they ran the speech recognition group for IBM, and they came, and then they kept bringing members of their group to Renaissance, and now they're running the company. So, and I've just been focusing on the foundation. In fact, one of our I mentioned the other programs, the basic science program, but we have a program called Math for America in New York City, which John Ewing, who was formerly the head of the executive director of the American Math Society, who was here. There he is with his wife Janice, and John runs that program, and it's a very successful program of getting competent teachers and rewarding them in the New York City schools and now in the state schools as well. And so that's what I do. So I gave a similar talk some years ago, and my wife said, "Well, you ought to end the talk with your values." And I said, I remember, I think we were in the car. And I said, "But I'm not sure I have any values." I don't know what my values are exactly, but I said, "Well, but I have some guiding principles. So we'll call them guiding principles, which I, looking back, I think I've probably followed. So I have 5 guiding principles. I'll happily tell you. So one of them is don't run with the pack. Try to do something that's original. Well, of course you want to do something original, but sometimes it's in math or in science in general, everyone's kind of running to solve the same problem, do the same thing. If you're really fast, maybe you're going to be the winner. But it's better, I think, probably you're not going to be the winner. But if you can sort of do an end run around things, think about something that other people aren't thinking about, that's a pretty good way to do things. Now, I've partnered with a lot of people, and I think that partnering with people is terrific, but you want to partner with wonderful people. And the names I've mentioned, Churn and Sullivan and various people, John Ewing, they've been really outstanding people, David Eisenbud, outstanding people. And you can leverage your own efforts and you sometimes get, partner up with people who are smarter than you, but that's fine. And but just have good choice in partners, and I think I've always tried to do that. A third principle is be guided by beauty. Now, you all are mathematicians, and mathematics is beautiful, and you know when an equation is great or an idea is very pretty and so on, and that's a wonderful aesthetic to follow. But it's not just true in mathematics. There are aesthetics in other enterprises. A well-run business is kind of a beautiful thing. If everything is just working just right and the pieces are meshing and it's a good organization, that's kind of beautiful. And it's so beauty can be a good guide. The penultimate principle is don't give up. I mean, now, sometimes discretion is the better part of valor, and you can just say the hell with it, but and go on to something else, and that's a decision that we've all made at one time or another. But persistence has a lot of value, and something that's really worthwhile can take a lot of time to come to fruition, and you ought to have patience if you believe in something to stick with it. And my final principle is hope for good luck. And that's it. So thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions, so the floor is open.
Okay, who has a question? All right, there's one there. And speak loudly.
So a lot of your stories were before, you did something kind of exciting that maybe didn't sound like the best idea at first, but you went ahead with it anyway and it turned out okay. So I would like to know if you have any wisdom to share about when not to do something. when do you hold back?
Well, I've not done a lot of things. So the question is, when do I have any wisdom about when not to do something? And well, I don't think I have any wisdom on that anyone else. It looks like a room full of sensible people, and you probably can, you've had a lot of opportunities to say no, and in particular, being head of a foundation, you really need to know how to say no, because if you well, anyway, I was going to tell a joke, but but I won't. Okay, another question. Yeah. I can't hear you.
Can you give us your thoughts on the hedge fund industry today, and what you think is working right, what you think is not?
Okay, my thoughts on the hedge fund industry today. Do I think it's working right, or I think it's or what's right or what's wrong? Well, there are a lot of hedge funds today. When I started this, there were a lot fewer. A hedge fund, for those of you who don't know what they are, is a fund that people invest in. The managers charge a percentage of the profits, typically, let's say 20%, and a fixed fee, maybe 1 or 2%, and they manage the money, and you hopefully benefit from it. Hedge funds have ebbed and flowed. I don't know what the word is. They've waxed and waned. They've got better and they've got worse. They go through periods where they seem to be doing all very well. The last 2 years, hedge funds have not done very well, but the markets have. One of the things that's good about some hedge funds buy and sell things, and they go long and they go short. You need a certain amount of volatility to make that work. If nothing's really moving, then it's hard to make money. There's a lot of competition in hedge funds. There's an awful lot of them today. So I think probably as a whole industry, it's not as successful as perhaps it was when there were fewer. But there are certainly some good hedge funds, and they come in all stripes. Our fund, as I've told you, was 100% systematic, and there aren't very many of those, but there are some, and a few of them are good. But there are many that have other policies and do fundamental trading, and it's a range of approaches. So that's all I can say about hedge funds, I think. Okay.
What's the reason that you chose to focus on these goal-oriented global collaborations on the
What's the reason? Why did you choose to focus on these collaborative, goal-driven things? Well, it's not our only focus. It's shaping up to be about a third of what we'll do, of what we're doing, and it's not there yet. I find it challenging and enjoyable. It's our autism project, which is certainly goal-driven and is collaborative, has shown me, yeah, this is a pretty good way to make progress, and I like working with people, and I like seeing people working together. So you have to be careful. You understand that the goal may be far off, but if they're making progress, like this Origins of Life, I mean, you know, I don't think in my lifetime I'm going to know the answer, which is really what's a completely plausible path, let's say, to RNA or something like that. From first principles, how do we get to that? On the other hand, I see them making some really nice progress, and how this chemical came to in existence or that. And they're also looking at exoplanets and seeing, and they can look at atmospheres of exoplanets and see what planets might have atmospheres that would be conducive to life. So a lot of science will get done, and gradually we'll eventually maybe we'll find the answer. So I like that approach. It's not the only approach. Most of the money we give out in mathematics is to individual researchers and so on, and all those people who held up their hands are individuals. But I like that. Yes.
When you were a kid, how did your parents help you foster your mathematical knowledge?
When I was a kid, how did my parents help foster my mathematical knowledge? That's the question, and the answer is they didn't. I mean, you know, they thought I was a good kid, and they were glad I liked school, but I don't think they said, this boy is going to be a mathematician or anything like that. So I wasn't pushed in any direction whatsoever, except to do my homework. I was not a good homework doer. In fact, I hated doing my homework. Yes?
In your professional life, when you look back, would you change anything, like going earlier into business or doing more mathematics?
Okay, so would I change anything as I look back in my professional life? Well, not really. I don't think I made any huge mistakes in my professional life. One doesn't know what a different path might have led to, but there's nothing that glares and said, oh my God, I wish I hadn't done that. I mean, there's certainly things in my life that I can say I wish I hadn't said that, or one thing or another, or gone out with that particular girl. But in general, no. When I look back, I think it was an okay path. There's no big change that I would want to make. Wait a minute. Okay, you next, but speak up.
With the collection of such smart people at Renaissance Technologies, and for all the years that you've been working there, I would think that, on one end, you guys try to make profit, and there's a lot of secrecy involved with your algorithms. But I would think that you probably came across a lot of potentially interesting knowledge or new science. Do you ever feel a need or a desire to share whatever interesting?
Okay. Okay, that's a good question. The question is at Renaissance, where the algorithms that they develop and the ideas are very proprietary and not, you can't patent them or copyright them, because people will just take it over and you just be in lawsuits all the time. The question is, if we're developing this kind of new science, would we have any wish to sort of share it with the general public in some sense or other? And the answer is no. No, but that's not meant as a joke. There isn't anything that these guys have done of such generality and power that it's a shame that the world doesn't know it. It's a very powerful group of people who can focus on data and get some very good results. But there's nothing but so general that it would really need to be shared with the world, as far as I know. Yes?
What do you think about math education in America? And can you tell us about where the MFA program came from and your thoughts on math education
Yes.
in America?
Yes. Okay. The question is, what are my thoughts on math education in America? And my thoughts are it needs to be better, as probably most of you realize. So kind of the background. I got interested in this because when I went to Berkeley to be a graduate student, I was the beneficiary of a National Defense Education Act fellowship. Now, only the old folks here have probably ever heard of the National Defense Education Act, but when Sputnik went up in 1957, the whole country went into spasm. And the Congress said, oh my God, you know, the Russians are going to beat us. They'll be on the moon throwing vodka at us soon. We can't get our satellites up. They got theirs up. We need to strengthen the scientific enterprise in the United States. And they did. They created the National Defense Education Act. They beefed up the National Science Foundation. When I got because I quarrel with John about this, but I'm going to give the statistic anyway. When I got my PhD in 1961, I think there were fewer than 100 people in the United States, certainly 100 Americans, who got PhDs in mathematics. 10 years later, there were 1,400. Now, 100 was too few. 1,400, we didn't know what to do with them because there weren't enough academic jobs. But and in other professions, other scientific areas, this was similar. There was a lot of growth, and we saw a national problem, Cold War, and we were going to solve it through building up our science, and we did. We did a marvelous job of building up science. Salaries went up in universities for those kind of folks, and a lot of people came in to science, young people, and it was a great success. So about 15 years ago, I looked around, maybe more than 15 years, but and I realized that the teaching math, I was only focusing on math, in our schools was really not very good. And I realized, like we all do, that the economy is becoming far more quantitative than it used to be 40 or 50 years ago, and more of things are based on quantitative methods, and we're not really keeping up. Our teachers, by and large, don't know, in particular in math, I think, the subject very well. Because if you know enough math to be a good high school teacher, and that means you know college math and something, so that you're not just one step ahead of the kids. If you know that much math, and you have the least mental agility, which you'll see in a second, I don't have, you know how to program a computer, you can go to work for Google, you can go to work for Microsoft, you can go to work for Apple. I have an Apple fellow right here in front of me. And you're going to get paid twice as much, and so on. So what's to keep someone who actually knows the field in the profession? Well, you might really like teaching, and that's great. But the pull out, so something needed to be done to make the job of teaching math, and in fact math and science, more attractive, so that we would educate our kids better and be able to compete in the world. And so I said, okay, I have a program, I know what to do. A friend of mine, or a guy who became my friend, Senator Schumer, had just been elected. And part of the reason he was elected is because I gave him $250 or whatever it was. Anyway, I was a supporter of Senator Schumer. I probably was a little more. But it wasn't some huge amount, but I had a party for him and became a friend. And as soon as he got elected, I went right to Washington. I said, here's an idea. You got to do this. And I said, create this program reward people who give teachers a test. If they pass the test, you give them money, and they'll be rewarded, and they'll stay in the schools, and people will be drawn into the field because they're going to get an extra stipend from the government, like the National Defense Education Act. He said, that's a great idea. I'll get right on it. And as I left his office, another group went in about, something about dams on the beaches of Long Island, and I heard him say, that's a great idea. I'll get right on it. I'm exaggerating slightly, but only slightly. So he didn't get right on it. We had a few conversations about it, but nothing was going to happen as a federal program. And so a few years went by, and then actually MSRI was kind of in the picture because we had a poker tournament to benefit at MSRI. David hooked me up with a few people in New York who were also in the financial business. I don't know where you found those guys. And we sat together. How can we benefit MSRI? And one of the guys was a poker player, and they were talking, and I said, hey, I like poker. I said, why don't we have a charity poker tournament? And we did. And it worked extremely well, and MSRI got the benefit. But I thought, well, if we're going to do this every year in New York, it better be something that really relates more to New York, because I'm not going to get these guys coming out every year to give money to MSRI, which is in California, and for math research. I don't know how we talked them into it the first time, but so then I thought, okay, maybe this is the time to start this program here in the city and just do it ourselves. And so we did, and we had the tournament every year, and that raised some money, and of course I provided a great deal of it on top of that, and so that the program was started privately. 2 years ago, the state of New York took on to do the same program outside the city as we're doing in the city, and they're building up. We have 800 teachers of now math and science in New York City. Next year it'll be 1,000, and that will be 10% of the math and science teachers in New York will be part of this core of really knowledgeable, committed teachers. They all get extra stipends and so on, and the state's doing the same thing. And we're hoping that other states in the country will take on. The federal government is in a state of paralysis, and it's probably better to work through states. But it's a long haul. That's a very long answer, I'm sorry. And maybe I'll take one more question. Okay.
As a former math student, math educator, what is your opinion of Bourbakism, which was certainly a powerful movement in mathematics in the 20th century?
You mean Bourbaki? Yeah, Bourbaki. Do you guys know about Bourbaki? You know about Bourbaki? Well, it was sort of the French, of course, did this. Any French people in the audience? No. They wanted to codify, all of, in the United States and England, we have common law, tradition, and the traditions grow up, and you go by various court cases, and that becomes the law, and one thing or another. In France, and it's not like that at all. Everything is codified. The whole, Napoleon wrote this code, and the French like to codify everything, and so Bourbaki wanted to get right down to it and codify mathematics in some way or other. And I think some of it was pretty good. I'm not an expert on it. What do you think about Bourbaki?
Well, you mentioned the National Science Foundation. It was created in 1958, by the way, by Congress.
Oh, that's when it was.
They created it.
I see. It was actually created at that time. Well, okay.
At that time, they did many good things, but you also had the School Mathematics Study Group. You figure that was a group of 40 individuals. 20 of them were math professors from leading universities. The other 20 were headmasters from
leading prep schools. And they appear to have been heavily influenced by Bourbaki. In fact, they wrote a booklet which contained the following statement, which I saw 50 years ago. They said, in the 1990s, every math student in elementary school will be exposed to topology.
Well, will he catch it? Will they catch it or just be exposed to it? There's no question, and I'm sure the federal money is not well spent, and my Republican friends think not a penny of it is well spent. But I think some of it is. Anyway, I think we have to stop. David is going to throw me off.
I am indeed.